This is the Siege of Malta lecture series, episode 5, Valette's Flawless Defence Part 2, the Siege of St Elmo. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we are back again with another instalment of the Siege of Malta lecture series. Tonight I have for you the second part in our sub-series of Valette and his flawless defence, and this time we will be focusing primarily on the defence of St Elmo, and so this episode will be called Valette's Flawless Defence Part 2, St Elmo. Tonight you'll be getting the very best of our man John de la Valette, and a very exciting episode which includes some major intrigues which occurred during the height of the battle for St Elmo. Before I begin, I just want to express my appreciation for my listeners. You know, we're on a journey here. Like, this channel will be big one day. I promise you that. This channel will be huge. And you are here with me on the very first few steps of that journey. And I know, it's no frills at the moment, but, what else do we need? We've got the history, and that's what everyone's here for. Everyone's here to be edified. Everyone has a passion for it. So, yes, I appreciate you all. And, this is the first few steps of what is going to be an enormous and exciting journey. Without further ado, to Malta. On the 25th of May, the Turks began to bring their main artillery across to St Elmo. When it was clear that this was happening, La Valette sent 100 knights of all nationalities over to the fortress to bolster the garrison. Colonel Mass, Lamotte, and their contingents were also sent there as reinforcements. 12 galley slaves from each of the 5 galleys were armed and given tools and sent over to aid in the defence. The Grand Master evacuated all women, children and elders from St Elmo to Birgu to take refuge. Only those who were able to participate in the fighting were to remain. Now there were 800 men of the garrison ready to defend the fortress against the imminent attack. The purpose of this civilian evacuation was to relieve the burden on the supplies within the fortress. What you have to remember is that Valette never expected St Elmo to be able to hold out against the Turks. It was always known that it would fall. It was just a question of how long, and Valette was playing for time. Valette knows as well he cannot defeat the Turks in a pitched battle engagement, as he is outnumbered 4 or 5 to 1, without even counting the weight of the Turkish artillery. So the only viable option now is to hold out in each of the fortresses for as long as possible and await relief. This was also the advice of Don Garcia de Toledo, although it seems completely obvious. If Valette was to engage in a pitched battle and then suffer significant losses, then he wouldn't have enough men to defend the fortresses. This would ultimately lead to a defeat and the end of his order. When we judge the success or failure of one's course of actions, there are different metrics we can do that by. Some according to long-term results, other to short-term results, etc. In this case, I'm going to judge the success of Valette's strategy according to his stated goal, and then subsequently by the merit of what he achieved when the stated goal was attained. We will get to that later at the end of this talk. To be clear, time is king. Unless a relief force shows up pretty much immediately, St Elmo is going to fall. The Turks think it's going to take 10 to 12 days, which seems reasonable to me, but no one can really 100% know. Balbi comments that if the fortress had been cut off from reinforcements early on, it could have lasted, 3 or 4 days. And that actually proved to be true, because pretty much immediately after it was cut off, that's how long it took for it to fall. I'm going to Malta in December, and I'm going to get drone footage of all these sites, including the crossing between St Angelo and the landing point of St Elmo. So you will be able to see exactly with your own eyes the distance and the position of both sides in relation to these things. What will surprise you is how exposed the crossing was to the Turkish cannon fire and musketry. It's a miracle that anyone would be able to make the crossing alive, but somehow they did. What will be obvious to all is that it would have been without doubt a short but harrowing journey. All of that will be included in a 2-hour lecture on the entire campaign, and it won't just be audio like this lecture is. It will have lots of video, photography, etc. I'm hoping to release that by the summer of 2025. I mean, that's the goal, but at the end of the day, it will take however long it takes, because I want it to be of the absolute highest quality. and I'm not prepared to sacrifice a shred of quality to meet the deadline in this case. The point being is that the ability to reinforce St Elmo from St Angelo is what's keeping this thing going. If they can't get men in there, then the fortress is going to fall rapidly because they are getting absolutely hammered. The defenders lose the Ravelin on Sunday the 3rd of June, which is the day after Dragut arrives, and Valette is exceedingly grieved at the loss of this fortification, given that no one really understands how it happened. Even now, the general consensus is that the sentries were asleep and then killed whilst they were sleeping. For those who don't know, a Ravelin is an outwork that comes out from a main curtain wall, and in this case, the Ravelin was surrounded by a ditch. Let me put it to you like this. If you're alive in June 1565 and you value your life, Fort St Elmo is the very last place you'd like to be. I would go as far as saying that tiny Fort St Elmo was the single most dangerous place to be on the entire planet at that time. The fort is getting absolutely hammered by artillery. Bombardments coming in day and night, and we are talking thousands of artillery rounds hitting the walls daily. One night records over 5,000 cannonballs being fired at St Elmo towards the end of June in one day. Unfortunately, this night did not survive the siege. Before we get into the meat of this lecture, I wish to discuss a certain element used in the defence of St Elmo, and indeed the rest of the Siege of Malta. And that element is a variety of incendiary weapon used by the knights. Particular, the firework hoop, which Balbi accredits to Valette, claiming that it was his invention. The firework hoop was a metal hoop like that which goes around a barrel, but it's wrapped in cloth or linen and doused in flammable material, saltpeter and pitch. It's then lit on fire, picked up with tongs, and then thrown into the ranks of the advancing enemy. There was other incendiaries like this, but the main one in this case was the firework hoop. These incendiaries were exceedingly effective against the Turks for a number of reasons. During assaults, the Turks would march together in tightly compacted ranks, which meant that firework weapons would be able to hit multiple targets and the flames would spread from person to person. Secondly, the Janissaries would wear long flowing robes, which would seem to be the absolute worst possible thing to be wearing with all of this fire being thrown everywhere. There are accounts of Janissaries being turned into human torches when hit with these incendiaries. Barrels of seawater were placed on the bastions throughout the siege so that if any of the defenders caught fire, then they could extinguish themselves. We have several accounts during the siege of these incendiaries actually catching fire to the people that were trying to use them, as well as setting fire to other stores of munitions. That said, all in all, throughout this campaign, the firework hoop and friends were highly effective weapons. All things considered, the Siege of St Elmo was a pretty standard set play, neither side doing anything out of the ordinary in their respective roles. The Turks are giving them a heavy, relentless bombardment trying to make breaches and reduce the ability of the defenders to return fire. The garrison are holding on for dear life, rebuilding the walls and fortifications where they can, and returning fire when there is an opportunity. All the while, La Valette is funneling reinforcements in from St Angelo to keep the defence fireable. This basically played out for the best part of 30 days. It's actually disputed when the siege proper began, but I just call it 30 days. The last 4 days, the fortress was isolated from St Angelo. Once breaches were made in the walls, the Turks made several attempts to get inside the fortress and storm it. These are called assaults. The largest of these assaults are made more formally, in which case they are called general assaults. General assaults are better organised and consist of high numbers of troops. The Turks would perform religious ceremonies and rituals before launching these general assaults, which would typically include prayers and sermons, plus the playing of musical instruments and the unfurling and displaying of banners and standards. These general assaults were huge efforts to storm the fortress, and when they were deployed prematurely, they would result in massive casualties for the attackers, as was witnessed at the Siege of Fort St Elmo on multiple occasions. We know from Balbi that there are several general assaults and multiple other smaller attempts to storm the fortress throughout the month of June. Not only was Valette reinforcing the garrison nightly by boat, He was also constantly receiving dispatches from the fort giving him up-to-date information regarding the situation inside. His commanders also made several inspections of the fort during the siege when the fortifications were literally crumbling around them and it seemed as though they could not hold out any longer. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what I really wanted to talk to you about tonight. This is the meat of the sermon, so to speak, and I've been looking forward to going through this since the day I had the idea for this lecture series. The episode I'm about to tell you about is a completely remarkable situation and an irresistible piece of drama during the siege. What I am referring to is the mutiny that began to begin on Friday the 5th of June. Because, I say that it began to begin because a mutiny never actually fully manifested. And the fact that it didn't manifest is a testimony of the great leadership ability of Valette, and also a testimony of the immense reverence and respect he was given by his men. It was on the 5th of June that the garrison of St Elmo, believing its fall was imminent, sent Captain Medrano over to the Grand Master to convey the hopelessness of their situation, that it was fruitless to try and hold out any longer, and that either they should abandon the fortress or sortie out and attack the Turks. To sortie out would mean guaranteed death for the garrison, but the idea was that they'd be able to inflict heavier losses on the Turks than would be done to them, which is a reasonable assessment. Valette tells Medrano that it's not yet time to make that decision and that the garrison is to continue to hold out until further notice, and Medrano goes back. The ravelin that I mentioned earlier, that outer work which is detached from the main fortress, now has Turkish batteries on it, and now heavy cannon fire is blasting the walls at point blank range. The Turks have also garrisoned the ravelin with arquebusiers, janissaries who are shooting anyone who puts their heads above the parapet with lethal accuracy. This meant that it was virtually impossible to keep even a watch on the front side of the fortress. Walls are crumbling, they're getting hit from all sides, and basically the situation is looking grim. Now, the murmurings that begin at this time, in my opinion, aren't born out of cowardice or disrespect for the order or its leader. My feeling is that the garrison didn't fear death, but rather feared dying pointlessly. At this point, they are hardly able to inflict any casualties on the Turks from where they are because the bombardment is so relentless and they are just pinned down by arquebus fire. They are basically just holding out, trying to survive. What they are doing though, just by being there, is stopping the Turks from storming the fortress. As we see repeatedly through this siege, that once the bombardment stops and there is an assault, or even a general assault, that is when the Turks are taking heavy casualties. That's when they're losing the big numbers. It's incredibly frustrating for the defenders though, because they're getting blasted for days at a time without being able to do anything and basically wait for an assault, which is when they get the chance to hit back and do some damage. Their concern at this point is that the defences are now too badly damaged, to the point that it was becoming so there was no safe place that couldn't be hit even inside the fort. And secondly, they were losing men daily from enemy artillery, and this was reducing their capability of effectively defending the fort when the next assault should come. I will add at this point, they are still receiving reinforcements, and they're still able to evacuate those who were so badly injured that they were unable to participate in the defence any longer. It was on the 8th of June that 50 knights, which was nearly all the knights of the garrison, signed a letter and formally asked Valette if they could have permission to sally out of the fort and attack the Turks in a last stand type situation. They also made destroying the bridge that the Turks were building a primary objective. If they were unsuccessful, the knights promised to spike the guns and poison the well so that they would be of no use to the Turks should they fall in battle. Balby records that the resolution of these knights weighed heavily on the Grand Master, as it was more than just one or two, but 50, which was basically all of them. To be clear, there are other soldiers in the garrison at this point, but the knights are for all intents and purposes in charge of everyone there. They're the senior soldiers there. Of course, the knights' designated commanders are the overall leaders, but the knights are certainly senior in comparison to regular infantry soldiers. Valette replied and acknowledged that they were prepared to die, but commanded them to remain at their posts, as this was essential for the salvation of the order. He reminded them of their vows, which had bound them unto death, and made it known that a relief force was expected hourly, which was not necessarily true, but he had to say it. His message could not have been clearer. Stay put and continue to hold out at all costs. This same day, the garrison had to endure a 7-hour assault from the Turks, during which they managed to kill 500 of them, most of them being Janissaries and religious fanatics, which I'm sure would have given them a great deal of enjoyment. The defenders had 40 men killed, and Valette immediately sent boats over from Birgu to evacuate the wounded. It was at this point that the defenders could hear tunnelling underneath them, and there were fears that the Turks were going to use a mine. Tunnelling played a big part at the Siege of Rhodes in 1522, much to the detriment of the knights. However, Malta being such a rocky place with little soil, it made sapping much harder and less effective. Clearly this didn't deter the knights, as they made several attempts throughout the siege to utilise their sappers, although their efforts did not amount to much. The attempts they did make must have been highly alarming to the defenders. Valette sent over 3 knights to determine the condition of the fort and the viability of continuing to hold out. Balbi gives us the names: Don Francisco Ruiz de Medina, a Spaniard; Don Constantino Castriota, an Italian; and Antonio La Rocha, a Frenchman. Upon their arrival, they discovered that the garrison was already preparing to abandon the fort, and had destroyed half their ammunition, and had begun throwing cannonballs into the cistern to make it unusable. There was also talk of a plan to blow the fortress to high heaven upon their departure, so as not to leave anything whatsoever for the Turks. Balbi made a point of saying that Colonel Mass was not exactly for these measures, but was backed into a corner by the number of knights opposing him and the extreme nature of the situation. The defenders keenly showed the inspecting knights the state of the fortifications and asked for their opinion. I must add as well that this was night time when this was happening, and the true state of the fortifications couldn't clearly be seen. Medina was doubtful that they would be able to continue to defend. La Rocha was more hopeful about the situation, but Castriota resolved that without doubt that the defence could continue and that it must. He gave directions that an inner defence should be constructed and that the defenders should take cover behind it. The garrison was outraged and questioned where they would get the materials to build such a structure. Ernley Bradford even puts a footnote in his translation of Balbi expressing his sympathy with the frustration of the defenders, who have endured ceaseless bombardments and multiple assaults, being told how to do their job by a knight who has just arrived from the relative safety of Birgu, and once his inspection is completed, he is to return back, leaving them again. In fairness to Don Constantino, as you shall see, he is more than willing to undertake the defence of the fort at the cost of his own life. He was a man of honour. The situation escalates and intensifies. The garrison begged the inspectors to stay until the morning so that the condition of the defences could be seen in the daylight. They also stipulated that if Don Constantino still believed the fort to be defensible, that he himself should stay and lead the defence. Don Constantino made it clear that this was not the purpose of their visit, and that he and his fellow knights would be leaving immediately. The garrison had other ideas. Colonel Mass then had the gate closed and swore that the knights would not leave whether they wished to or not. So as you can see, the situation has now reached a critical point. These knights are on the very brink of mutiny, and this is an incredibly delicate situation. If order is not restored swiftly, then it could well be that they are going to lose the fortress now. If this had not been nipped in the bud, so to speak, then the entire outcome of this war and subsequently the future of Europe would have been very different. I will stress again that the defenders are not so much concerned with the preservation of their lives, but rather that they are to make their final stand. They falsely imprisoned or taken hostage the knights sent by the Grand Master to make a report for him, and now it's in the hands of La Valette to bring the situation back under control. Initially, it was the bailiff of Negrepont who acted to stop this imminent madness from transpiring. He had an alarm sounded, ordering all the men to their posts. This alarm, which was instinctively followed by the garrison, gave the bailiff the opportunity to get the gate open and let the inspectors out of the fort. The knights crossed over and reached Birgu by midnight and gave their report to the Grand Master and his council. They denied the existence of a mine and said that the Turks were simply taking away the stones to make shelters for themselves. The opinion of the council was divided, with the main points of contention being the preservation of the garrison in St Elmo, the capability and potential of the fort to hold out, and whether or not the fort could hold out for any meaningful amount of time. By reinforcing St Elmo, which was by now clearly destined to fall, Valette was depleting Birgu of men that would be needed to defend these fortresses when the next blow should fall on them. Valette heard both sides of the argument but resolved to continue to reinforce and hold out the fort for as long as possible. Don Constantino proposed that he should be placed in charge of the defence and was told by Valette to put this forward at the council meeting the next day. In the morning, just as the council was set to debate this matter, two swimmers arrived from St Elmo, each with a letter. The first letter stated that the garrison was in a state of utter confusion and despair and demanded that the fort be evacuated. The second letter seemed to complain of the Grand Master and the council for not having arranged the evacuation and not sending them sufficient equipment for the defence. In this letter they requested that adequate provisions and munitions be sent as well as reinforcements so that they could hold the fortress until the end. It appears this second letter was sent after they had learnt that Don Constantino was potentially coming to take charge of the defence. Had this have happened, then the garrison would have been considered a disgrace. Subsequent events meant that Don Constantino was not sent to St Elmo, despite his valiant offer to take 500 men across and take charge himself. La Valette wrote to the knights in St Elmo saying he felt sorry that men who had already given ample proof of their bravery should abandon the fort. He reminded them also of their vows they had taken when they entered the order. He also wrote to Miranda telling him not to forget the confidence he had placed in him, and he must do his best to dissipate the mutiny and bring the men back under orders. Valette's letters were read to the garrison by Miranda and the bailiff of Negrepont, and the garrison was so moved by Valette's words that they were all persuaded to stay and defend the fort to the bitter end. Valette was informed immediately of their change of heart, and 100 soldiers under Orazio Martello were sent across to reinforce them, as well as ammunition and money to pay them. In order to make the enemy think a much larger relief force was arriving, the reinforcements carried with them a great number of banners. This is the end of the mutiny of St Elmo, and the siege resumes as per norm from here. As you have just witnessed, what an incredibly delicate situation this period of the siege was. Valette's ability to resolve that situation to the satisfaction of everyone involved under the most critically dangerous and hellish conditions imaginable is an absolute masterclass in leadership. These were men who had been under heavy bombardment for days in a ruined fortress, seeing their friends and brothers in arms blown to pieces and slain by the sword. Men who were surely about to sacrifice their own lives. It was only the wisdom of Valette that was able to steer this volatile situation away from disaster. It was truly a masterclass in closing. Going back to the siege, we know that Valette was able to reinforce St Elmo up until Wednesday the 20th of June, by which date it was completely cut off and finally fell on June the 23rd. The job of the garrison had been done as well as it could have been, and now it was over. The question would be whether or not their sacrifice would be in vain, or had their blood purchased enough time to ensure the relief of the defenders of Malta. We are now approaching the end of this excellent and world-class lecture, and the time has come for me to ask you this. Did Valette achieve success in his strategy to hold out in Fort St Elmo, despite the eventual loss of the fortress? I will give you my own analysis. To be clear, the stated goal of Valette was to hold out in St Elmo for as long as possible as a means to buy time for the defenders in Birgu and St Michael in order to strengthen their defences, and also to receive relief from Don Garcia of Toledo coming from Sicily, who was famously late in his coming to Malta. As it happened, the defenders were able to hold out for far longer than anticipated. The result being more time was allowed for the defence of Birgu and St Michael to be prepared, which was absolutely necessary. The other option was to abandon St Elmo entirely and add its garrison to the weight of the defences elsewhere. This would have totalled over 1,500 men. In my opinion, this would not have worked, and that's not a criticism of any of the war council that suggested it, because the council was divided and both options were credible. Of course, I have the luxury of hindsight knowing the outcome of the war. If Valette had chosen to withdraw the garrison from St Elmo and give up the fortress, then Birgu and St Michael would have been attacked by highly motivated Turkish forces with sky-high morale after their latest conquest. More importantly though, the defenders would not have had time to make the necessary additions and modifications to the fortifications. Looking back, we know that if they had been attacked under these conditions, then Birgu and St Michael would have surely fallen. However, the fact is that the investment of St Elmo caused the Turks such catastrophic losses in men and munitions that their morale was critically damaged after the siege of this relatively small fortress. When the Turks properly besieged Birgu and St Michael, it was after they had already taken enormous losses in the siege and capture of St Elmo. St Elmo, of course, being a much smaller fortress as well. To be blunt, I am saying that yes, the sacrifice of these 1,500 men was worth the 30 days that it took the Turks to capture St Elmo, and also the 6,000 plus men that it cost them to take it. Valette, who is without doubt the hero of the hour and clearly a military genius, was absolutely perfect in the foresight and execution of his strategy. He inspired the faith in his men to face certain death in the face of insurmountable odds for the benefit of Christendom and the salvation of the Order of the Hospital of St John of Jerusalem. He was nothing of the kind of World War I general ordering his subordinates to march into enemy gunfire while sitting behind a desk in the safety of a bunker miles away from the front. Every man who was there knew that Valette asked nothing of his men that he himself would not do. Yes, St Elmo was lost, but the next blow fell on Birgu, and Valette was there on the front with lance in hand at 70 years old. I will not say any more about that because that is going to get its own lecture in this series. What I'm trying so hard to convey to you is the unbelievable leadership ability and the military and strategic genius of this man, La Valette, who is hardly even known to the people of Europe. This man, by his epic defence, surely stopped the takeover of Europe by the Turks and their wretched, barbaric religion of Islam. If Malta had fallen, then next would have been Sicily, and the soft underbelly of Europe would have been open for invasion. Valette is a hero in my eyes. I have personally visited his tomb in the Cathedral of St John in Valletta on 3 occasions, and I am sure to do so each time I return to Malta. This Jean de la Valette ought to be taught about in schools and talked about by fathers to their sons. And I encourage my listeners to tell these stories to your friends and family if they have a passion or an interest in history. You can enlighten them about this seemingly obscure event that happened in 1565, which is far more significant than you could ever know. Tell them the stories of the bravery of the knights and the soldiers and of their great leader La Valette, because we need that kind of inspiration in our society today, and we need to look up to men and to heroes like this. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening, and I will return soon with another lecture.